Hey guys, before you start this screencast, make sure you took the evolution pre-quiz. It's just that true and false quiz about what evolution is and isn't. I was going to start this screencast with a little clip from The Simpsons, but when I uploaded this to YouTube, they told me it was copyright infringement. But if you want to watch it, you can check out this PowerPoint or what Google presentation and click on that, and there's kind of a funny little evolution of Homer Simpson or Homer sapien. I also saw this, which shows the evolution of humans, and we kind of regress to our desks. Hopefully by taking that quiz, you got a sense of what evolution is not, and I want to just be clear that evolution in the biological sense is not a theory. It is, in fact, a fact that's been supported by tons and tons and tons of scientific research. It is not something that I'm asking you to believe in. Your belief system is totally separate. It really isn't concerned with the origin of life. Chemical evolution is a whole nother field that is still up for a lot of debate. We're talking about the origin of organisms. And it's not just concerned with the origin of humans at all. In fact, it's a lot easier to find evidence of biological evolution with other organisms. And although Charles Darwin gets a lot of credit for having come up with natural selection, the idea of evolution was not discovered by him. In fact, he was influenced by a lot of people, and you'll find out about that in a movie that we'll watch on Monday. It is not the same thing as natural selection. It involves more than that, especially now that we know more. It's not something that just happened in the past. In fact, we can find evidence of evolution happening right now. It's not something that happens to individuals. It happens to populations. It's really not accidental or random, although the initial mutations that drive evolution are random. The actual process isn't really that accidental, and it's shaped by the environment. And there really is absolutely no evidence against it. Just like the scientific method shows that once you find evidence to refute a hypothesis, you have to reject it. And at this point, there's been no evidence to refute evolution. It was definitely not contrived to undermine religion. In fact, it should go along with most of the world's religions. And it certainly does not deny the existence of God. And therefore, it should be able to jive with any religion. So if those popular ideas about evolution are all wrong, what is evolution? Well, it's essentially just the process where new species arise from earlier species by accumulated changes. Sometimes we refer to that as descent with modification. Sort of the textbook definition is it's a process that results in heritable changes in a population spread over the course of many generations, and it takes a lot of time. Evolution can be precisely defined as any change in the frequency of alleles within a gene pool from one generation to next. And this is why we talk about genetics before we talk about evolution. So how does it happen? How does the giraffe get its long neck? How did the anteater get its long nose? Well, this guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, around a little bit before and during Darwin's lifetime, had this idea that organisms do change over time. And he had a lot of interesting ideas, and he basically thought that the anteater could stretch and stretch and stretch his nose within his lifetime and then pass that gene on to his offspring. And so it's that idea of inheritance of acquired traits. He proposed that a change in the environment, so the need to have a longer nose, could change the animals in response. And if the animal used one part of its body frequently, then it became stronger. If he didn't use it, it would disappear. But his main point was that you could then pass on this lengthened nose to your offspring. Here's a little animation to show that.
A comparison of Lamarckian and Darwinian theories. Click on the images to know more about respective theories.
So we'll click on Jean-Baptiste Lamarck.
The Lamarckian theory. Evolution of the long neck of the giraffe. Ancestral giraffes probably had short necks that were subjected to frequent stretching to enable the giraffes to reach the foliage of trees. The offsprings had longer necks that also were stretched frequently in the quest for food. Eventually, the continuous stretching of the neck gave rise to modern giraffes. Existing data does not support this theory.
So, this is about the same as saying, okay, well, I want to be taller, so I'm going to stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch throughout my lifetime and reach and reach and reach and reach, and then maybe I can get a little bit taller and then pass that on to my children. Or if I lift weights and I get stronger and stronger and stronger and I get big muscles, I give birth to a really strong muscled baby. We all know that that's not really how it works. Charles Darwin, on the other hand, who we'll learn about on Monday, the guy with the big white beard, was influenced by a couple of very different non-scientists. Well, I guess Charles Lyell was a geologist, but not a biologist. And he was around saying, he wrote a book about geology, and he basically was like, gosh, you know, there's some things that I notice happening to the earth, erosion and deposition, and I think this has been happening for a really long time, and I think that the world is actually quite a bit older than it really is. And that helped Darwin see that maybe some of the changes that happen to species happen over millions of years, and maybe even hundreds of millions of years. Then Thomas Malthus, an economist who wrote about human population, noticed that with human population, that growth always was, if you continued growing human population, they would overpower the food supply and create hunger, disease, and struggle. But in general, populations don't do that. They sort of stay in check. So he kind of started to come up with this theory of natural selection. And natural selection is different than evolution. It says here, if evolution were the car, then the theory of natural selection would be the engine that drives that car. So ideas about evolution were being discussed long before Darwin came along. But people just weren't able to really explain it, and they weren't able to give it a mechanism. They noticed that organisms changed. They found dinosaur bones. They knew dinosaurs didn't exist anymore. But they were having a hard time explaining it, and they really wanted to believe that species evolved from one form to another, but they didn't really have a process to make it happen. So the theory of natural selection was a way to give a reasonable driving force behind evolution. So here's what Darwin had to say about the giraffe.
Of Lamarckian and Darwinian theories. Click on the images to know more about respective theories. The Darwinian theory. Evolution of the long neck of the giraffe. Ancestral giraffes probably had necks that varied in length. The variations were hereditary. Darwin could not explain the origin of variations. Competition and natural selection led to the survival of longer-necked offsprings at the expense of shorter-necked ones. Existing data supports this theory.
So Darwin basically came up with this idea of natural selection, and he thought, well, there probably were a bunch of different variations in a trait, and the giraffes with the longer necks were able to live longer, reproduce more, and pass their genes on more frequently. So the first part of his theory of natural selection is that overpopulation is always an option for organisms, but for some reason they rarely do overpopulate. So all species have the potential to overpopulate the Earth, but usually they remain stable. And I think last year almost all of you learned about J curves and S curves. And while the human population growth is kind of going through a J curve right now, most wildlife populations stabilize in a healthy ecosystem and they reach carrying capacity. And he thought, well, that's interesting. So not all of them, keep surviving, and something keeps a population in check. He also noticed that with all populations, there's always competition, but and it's because of competition that not all organisms survive to an old age. Frog lays 1,000 eggs, but only about 10 of those become big frogs, and that has to do with competition. And he also noticed that within a population, there's always variation. He didn't really understand why there was variation, but he knew that there was variation and that different individuals had different traits, and some of those traits were more beneficial than others. We know now that that variation is due to genetics and mutations, but at that point he just said, look at the finches out in the Galapagos. There's ones with sharper beaks for insect eating, and then this guy's got a sort of fat beak for bud and fruit eating. But he realized that they all probably came from the same ancestral bird, and over time they changed, and they avoid competition by changing. Or they didn't really change, but they had mutations that made them more successful at exploiting different parts of the niche. He's kind of most famous for this idea of survival of the fittest, but it's just that idea that some members of a population have a trait that helps them or makes them better adapted for their environment, and because of that, they're more likely to survive longer, and then they reproduce, and they have a lot of offspring. So it's sort of like the giraffe that had a longer neck could reach the higher leaves, and the lady giraffes were like, hey, that's pretty cool. He's strong. He eats a lot of green leaves. I want to mate with him. And then she has offspring that have longer necks, and then longer necks become more prevalent. So it's all about getting your genes into the population. And that goes along with reproduction, because members who survive longer and reproduce more are going to pass on their genes more frequently than those that don't have well-adapted traits. And then finally, after a certain amount of time, evolution by natural selection can account for the formation of new species and the diversity of life on Earth. So as new alleles, mutations come, traits are passed on, it gets to a point where they no longer interbreed with organisms that are different than themselves. I was going to show you a clip of Cosmos with a guy named Carl Sagan. He's a really interesting professor from Cornell who's no longer alive, and he explains evolution by natural selection pretty clearly. So I'll put the link to that in Schoology, and you should watch it, but I don't want to get in trouble for copyright issues, so I'm not going to write that right now. I'm not going to play it right now. Hope you got all the notes, and we'll watch a movie about Darwin on Monday. Thanks.